Okay, here's a great show for you. This is going to be just terrific, I'm telling you now. I don't say that all the time either. This is Think Tech Talks with Scott Campbell. He formerly was professor at HPU. Now he's a visiting professor from Michigan, University of Michigan, yeah? Oh. And he's visiting HPU and UH and various organizations around town to talk about his specialty. And his specialty is cell phones. But it's not the technology per se, it's the whole shtick about how it has affected our society. Very interesting. We're calling this show Cell Phones, the Real Message. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you for having me, Jay. I'm really happy to be here.
So cell phones have driven you. I mean, you went to graduate school in order to study the effect of cell phones on our society.
This is true. I was working in the industry for Sprint PCS at their world headquarters in the late 1990s. And I was working in product development and in marketing. And after a few years of that, I really sort of felt like something important was happening. And I decided that I wanted to examine what was happening socially with this technology instead of trying to develop it and market it and those kinds of things. So absolutely, it inspired me to go to graduate school.
And we were talking before about how it really pays to be old, because then you have a point of reference maybe that looks back at the way it was before all this happened, you know, to regular landline phones, which, I mean, everybody's giving them up now. Yeah. Our society is becoming dominated, not only here, but everywhere in the world by cell phones. Incredible. And we have to examine that. And a lot of people, like you said, are fish in the water. They don't know that they're in the water.
Right.
Because they've always lived in the water, and they don't know what happened before, or for that matter, what's likely to happen in the future. So that's why I'm so excited about this show. Great. So tell us give us a little précis of the evolution of the phone from the time you got involved.
Sure, absolutely. Well, in 1997, when I was at Sprint PCS, we launched the first national digital mobile communication network. We've had analog cell phones around for a long time, those giant things that Gordon Gekko was using.
The brick.
The brick, right, yeah. Right. But nobody really had those. I mean, they were for wealthy business people.
It cost $1,000 a piece or more.
And the networks didn't have any capacity, so there were hardly any users really. And then we launched the first digital services that had much more capacity to support users, and the technology was cheaper, and the infrastructure was cheaper, and it didn't take long before it kind of reached a critical mass. And as you know, at that time, we're talking about pretty much calling and texting. And initially, it was mostly calling, not a lot of texting in the early days.
Well, you had a separate pager. Remember the days of the pager?
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a single individual in the world who has a pager now. I don't think so.
I don't know. Yeah, I haven't seen one of those in years. Right. We could probably call that, though, mobile communication as well, because you're moving around and all these things. But so early on, it had a limited capability, so really what people used it for was to stay in touch with their close ties. We didn't have a phone book for cell phones in the early days, or even today, so you gave your number out to the people that you wanted to use it with.
And it was very private that way.
It was very private that way, and I think that's where, the most profound impacts in the early days were in the private realm of your core ties, and I'd be glad to talk to you about some of the social consequences there.
I want to know.
And then the public realm of the places that we occupied and shared space with others while we were connecting to our core ties. So I'd be happy to talk about some of the implications on that side too.
Well, tell us the early effects, okay? This is the day before we saw the smartphone. Mm-hmm. They were primitive, not everybody had them, but already they were changing our way of dealing, changing our way of communicating, changing our way of behaving in public, I think. Mm-hmm. So what is your analysis for the early days?
Well, we're still getting that sorted out a little bit in terms of the scholarship. And that's one of the things that I'm doing right now for a book that I'm working on, is I'm digging through a lot of the early research to try to get a handle on what what the actual impacts are. There's a lot of narratives about the impacts, but what are the actual impacts? And I think some of the most obvious things that we see include the way that this anytime, anywhere availability to each other, direct access to each other, which is different than the landline phone. The landline phone, you would communicate through a place. You know, you'd go to a place that had the right infrastructure to use. And I think laptops are like this too. You take it around from place to place. You take your cell phone around from place to place, but you don't use these other portable media while you're actually moving around. So you're really not available all the time. All of this availability, I think, really kind of it speeded up our communication with our loved ones and our close ones. And it kind of helped establish some new rhythms of interaction, and it kind of raised the expectations to be accessible to one another for better and sometimes for worse.
My brother calls me on the phone, on the cell phone, of course, and he says, "Where are you?" And I say, "I'm at the phone." Referring back to an earlier time, you know, where the phone was geographically rooted somewhere.
Right.
But it's a play on words.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the interesting things about it is location and how important that is of a piece of context and the way that we have to build that in now to our social interactions. You know, we ask, where are you? What are you doing? You know.
Right. Because you don't know.
Yeah, if you call their personal number before the cell phone, you know exactly. You don't know maybe if they're in the bedroom or the kitchen, but you know they're at home, you know. And so now we have to explain where we are and what we're doing and these kinds of things.
Now, what about the whole thing about good manners and all that?
Yeah.
I think in the early days, as with computers, there was a sort of decline in what people perceived to be good manners because of this technology, no?
Right, absolutely. It's torn at the traditional social fabric, you know, of what's acceptable behavior around others in shared space. And so some of the things that people talk about in the research are, you know, how irritating it is when people are using their mobile devices around others, the reasons why it's irritating, trying to explain that and what we can do to mitigate that intrusion. And some really interesting things pop up, like forced eavesdropping is one of the biggest complaints that from the early days.
What is that?
Forced eavesdropping is the idea that you're a bystander, you know, you're at a coffee shop or you're somewhere in public, you know, shared space, and somebody's on their cell phone. And first of all, you know, it can be irritating to you because it's like they're privatizing this public area. And it's uncomfortable. It's embarrassing to be the person who's eavesdropping on someone else. That's a faux pas.
Yeah.
And they're forcing you to do that.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, you only get half the conversation.
Right.
If you're going to be forced to eavesdrop, you might as well be able to hear the whole thing, and you can't.
Right.
So it's frustrating.
I can see
sometimes.
there's plenty of room for practical jokes. I mean, the guy could be, you know, making believe he's talking to his broker, and I say, "I want 10 million shares of IBM, and I want them right now."
Buy. Right. Talking to his roommate or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, so that's one of the big things that people were looking at in the early days and trying to figure out and trying to negotiate. And there were new norms that were established on public transportation, and it depends on what culture you're in, of course. But like in Japan, they developed this this convention where, okay, no talking. It's just too irritating. It's too densely populated. Texting is okay, you know, and they got that worked out pretty earlier than other places. So.
Well, that's an interesting part of all this, is that the U.S. really invented the cell phone. I mean, there's no question about
Bell
that.
Labs, right.
And then before you know it, other countries that were behind us technologically adopted the cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
Even places that had no electricity, they would have a little sort of generator set in the middle of the village.
That's right.
And it would generate cell phone, you know, wireless connections.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who had never seen a real phone, I mean, a landline,
right.
Now they were using the most modern, up-to-date cell phones, changed their whole world. Talk about disruptive.
That's right.
And then you look at Asia, look at Japan, Korea, for that matter, China. All of a sudden, they were doing stuff that was like at the push of the envelope
Right.
for us.
Right.
They were jumping into the new technology.
And I feel like so working in the industry at the time, as we were, you know, launching the technology, developing the technology in the United States, kind of there first, right? But then quickly surpassed in these other places, Northern Europe, the Pacific Rim, certainly Japan. I think one of the explanations, though, is when I was working at Sprint PCS, we launched this network using very high-end technology called CDMA.
I remember that.
Okay, yeah, CDMA, And we were so proud of ourselves because we were competing against AT&T and some, and so we felt like we were the best. But the thing is that these other lesser networks were more ubiquitous and worked together better, more cooperatively. So in Europe, for example, roaming in these things worked, right? And in the US in the early days, like you couldn't text somebody on a different network because you were on CDMA, they were on GSM, a different type of network. So what we were so proud of doing, really, I think slowed down the adoption of the technology because it didn't work very well across the different network lines, whereas it did in other places. So I think this is part of the reason why we were slow in the US, even though it was developed in the US.
I remember you'd have to get another kind of phone to go overseas.
Right.
You know, that was silly. Or switch chips. I don't think that happens much anymore.
Sometimes people do.
Sometimes,
SIM cards.
yeah.
Sure, yeah.
But talk about the social implications of this.
Yeah.
Now, I think your point a minute ago is really, really critical, is that we were available 24/7.
Right.
Or arguably, I mean, hypothetically, although some people turn them off and put them in the dresser drawer.
Sure, yeah.
And we were obligated to respond much more quickly than on a cell phone. And at the same time, voicemail.
Right.
On the landline and automatically on the cell phone.
Right.
So all of a sudden, our lives didn't belong to us anymore.
Yeah, and I think this is the fish in the water piece of this, is that now we've gotten to a point where the expectations they're very high to be accessible. And I think that we experience those expectations, but I don't know if we're that aware of them. I think that we just take it for granted
Right.
that, But I would say, though, that one of the concerns that we see from the earlier days of the technology was that maybe people are so in touch and so plugged into their core networks that are they maybe too in touch to the extent that they're not as likely to maybe reach out beyond them to their weaker ties or new ties, or even participating in their community or in civics or in politics. There was a fear, I think, in the early days that we were kind of telecocooning ourselves, getting wrapped up in the personal lives of our network ties that we knew really well because of how much in touch we were with them.
Yeah, the limited group of friends and colleagues
Right.
who we could text or call on our cell phones.
Right.
And I remember seeing people, talk about the Japanese, I was on a trip to Japan, and I thought it was the invasion of the body snatchers. Everybody was texting at every street corner.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you think about it, they were texting their friends.
Yep, that's who they
It was
text.
a small group, and they were just always in touch with their friends. But
You
they
don't
weren't,
text the pizza guy, right?
Right. Yeah, if they weren't looking 5 feet ahead of them on the sidewalk,
Yeah.
they were in the cocoon, as you say.
It was Japan where we first realized what the future was going to look like with cell phones, that people were going to spend more time actually looking at their cell phones than listening to their cell phones.
Surely that
And
happened.
that started, I think, in Japan.
You
that-
can go
that turn.
anywhere now in the world, and you can see a bunch of people in a restaurant at a table,
Yeah.
and none of them are talking to each other. They're all got the cell phone now. It's
Right.
amazing.
So I think there was a change, though, from the 2G feature phone, the brick phone or the basic calling and texting, to today's 3G and 4G smartphones. In that, whereas people were kind of concerned about those cocoons, right, in the early days, because you're so connected to your core ties. Now it seems like it's more like we're more connected to our core ties, and we're more connected outside of our core ties with social media on our mobile phones and all kinds of ways of reaching out beyond our core ties. And now I think that one of the interesting questions is, what does that mean? What does it mean that we're not just more connected inside of our private realms, but more connected in all aspects of our lives? And there's a lot to celebrate about that, and there's a lot to be concerned about.
Yes. And we're going to take a short break.
Okay.
When we come back, we're going to answer that question. Scott
Okay.
Campbell is going to answer that question, and I want to hear the answer. But right now, we're going to take a break because I got to make a call.
I'll make it.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and one of our delights is to be partnered with Think Tech Hawaii and produce programs every week. Every Monday at 2 o'clock, we have a show called E Hana Kako, which means let's work together. So we bring people from all across the nation and the country, and certainly throughout the islands, together here to talk with them about how to work together, and how to work together to do the following: to build a better economy, a better government, a better society. So if you're interested in the research of our think tank, the Grassroots Institute, or if you're interested in how that's applied at the governmental and community and business levels, you'll enjoy the fascinating conversations with our guests on Ehana Kako every week on Think Tech Hawaii at 2 o'clock on Mondays. Until our next show, I'll see you. Aloha.
Bingo, we're back. We're here with Scott Campbell, former professor at HPU, visiting professor at HPU and UH from the University of Michigan. We're talking about cell phones. I guess that means mobile phones, the real message. And it has changed our society. We're exploring exactly how. So I can text, and the group of my core group grows because the technology grows. All of a sudden, the prices are down, for voice and data. And my reception is better, way better. And the phones are uniform or more uniform.
They work across networks, at least.
Across networks and across continents. This expands my world, okay? And we know this must change the way human beings think of themselves, think of their relationship with the society close to them and far away. But you were going to say how?
Sure. Yeah. So the concerns I call the earlier concerns about cocooning kind of reaching in socially at the expense of reaching out, kind of like a zero-sum game. And with today's technology, the way that we can reach out beyond our core ties through social media and all sorts of other features on the phone. I call it reaching in and reaching out at the same time. And it's good to be connected. There's no doubt about it. There's always two sides of the story. One of the things that I'm thinking about lately, as well as a few others, is what does this mean for solitude? Those moments that we have where we're unplugged, just to ourselves. Sherry Turkle is a professor at MIT who's raising the same questions, and I've been doing some thinking about this. And I think that when we have so much more communication in our lives, right? The cell phone doesn't really take away from other things other than the landline phone. It kind of just adds on top of everything else, right? It's kind of an added layer.
It adds obligations and powers and obligations of connectivity.
Yeah, heightens our expectations to one another. And so solitude, not being around not communicating with other people, those moments of being alone, which are valuable, it can happen on accident where you find yourself alone. Maybe you're just, maybe you're waiting in line somewhere and you're not interacting with anybody and you don't mean to be alone, but you are. And then you can do it on purpose. You can go to Diamond Head and hike it by yourself and spend some time up there, not engaging with other people.
You better take a cell phone, because if you hurt yourself, you can call for help.
You call for help, or take your cell phone and take some pictures of Waikiki Beach from the top,
All it's irresistible.
Right.
So would John Henry Thoreau have had a cell phone at Walden Pond?
Oh, I think he might have had one and then not admitted it. Yeah, I think he would have had one and not admitted it. But that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. And so to me, there's two important things. We're more connected in all aspects of our lives. And now that the technology really isn't new anymore, I mean, there's new features and things like that. But the whole idea of being mobile, right? That's not new. Now we're used to that. It's a basic expectation, so we don't think about it so much anymore. We expect it. Like, I couldn't tell you how many times I've checked my watch in a given day because it's like a habit. I don't really think of it. It's a taken for granted thing. Cell phones are like that now too. I think you put those things together, and we need to be more deliberate about the solitude that we do have in our lives. We can't take it for granted that solitude is just going to happen, because I think people, without really thinking, fill in those gaps by reaching out while they're filling in those little dead moments.
It's gratification. It's gratification and being engaged, And I say that in a sort of psychological way, but when you are engaged, you are, a social animal, and you are having gratification by being. I'm having gratification right now with you.
Thank you, Jay. So am I.
Oh, good. Mutual. And so if I'm alone, I don't have that, and therefore, I'm kind of hooked on gratification. I'm hooked on being a social animal, and it's harder for me to put the cell phone in the drawer or turn it off and be disconnected from all the things that might give me gratification. I think it's harder to be in Walden Pond now than it ever was.
Oh, I agree. I mean, some of it's urbanization and simply more people and more places where people go, and mobility in other ways too, getting around with transportation. But a lot of it, I think, is just, it's difficult not to plug in socially sometimes, to unplug. And especially for young people that grow up with the technology, we've changed with the technology as it's been introduced, but young people grow up with it.
The frame of reference is right now.
Yeah.
And this brings me to some of the other steps along the trail, so to speak. So all of a sudden, it wasn't a clam phone, and it was way beyond just a cell connection and texting. Now, smartphone. I was telling you before the show, I walked into CompUSA one time years ago, had to be, like shortly after the year 2000. And I said, I want a phone where I can make notes like a PDA, which I think stands for Personal Digital Assistant, like
right.
that,
Yeah.
which was just a kind of note-take kind of thing.
Yeah.
They said, oh, that'll never happen. Okay.
Wait a few years.
Wait a few years, didn't take long, but I think that was, I don't know if you would say disruptive, maybe you could opine on whether it was disruptive. When you put them together, the PDA and the phone, now there was more. Now you could do much more than just texting and calling. Now you could make notes.
Right.
You could have the internet,
Right.
which was itself disruptive,
Sure.
with you all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I want to add one other thing. Apple. Apple comes out with the smartphone. What's disruptive about that is the notion of apps. Because
Right.
not only do you have the ability to get on the web, but you have all these programs for 99 cents or free.
Right.
And that, another completely disruptive thing. And all this happens within 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and it means different things to people in different parts of the world. You mentioned the apps, and I think apps, especially messaging apps right now, are extremely popular because the mobile companies, we're looking to make money off of texting, and so in some places it's pay as you go, and that gets really expensive, and they run out of credits and they wait, or and they do really interesting things to work around it. Before we had these messaging apps, they would do beeping or flashing, it's called, where you call somebody and then you hang up right away because they've got credit on their phone, and so they call you back, or
So peculiar.
Yeah,
really.
yeah. And so now, WhatsApp and things like that are workarounds, that free opportunities to message all that you want. And people really want to do that. They want to stay connected in that way, text-based, but also at some point in time, I think we should talk about images and visuals and the changes that have happened in terms of movement from text to images and what's going on there.
Yeah,
because that's, to me, that's really interesting to me, is one of the more recent trends you see with Instagram and Facebook. People are taking pictures and uploading them, right? And they're kind of being archived up there, right? And now with Snapchat, and I think that what we're seeing is sort of a shift where we're realizing we're taking so many photos, constantly, that it becomes overwhelming to archive them and show them to your kids 30 years later. That's not really the point so much. I think the point is just to capture the moment in a very economical way where you can say a lot with a picture. You can say a lot more with a picture than just a few words. Now you can put a few words on your picture and then just let that go. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing these days, visually, is saying a lot with just a little bit.
Why do people want to take those pictures? What makes them so fascinated with taking pictures all the time on their cell phones?
I think it says more. I think that if you are, so I'm a professor, right? And a lot of the context of mobile communication that I anecdotally witness every day is from my students, and they're doing it while I'm teaching, right? So if you're a student in a classroom and your professor is giving a lecture and you text, your friend or something and say, "I'm bored," that begs the question, right? Why are you bored? What's going on? But you take a photo, right? And then you tag it with "I'm bored," right? That explains all of it, right? It's economical. You can say an awful lot more that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. And I think that people, they're still taking pictures and archiving them, but they're doing something else with photography. They're capturing moments, sharing those moments as if they're not real if you don't share them, and then just letting them go.
Yeah. Tim Cook has been on, he'd been talking of Apple, been talking with Charlie on PBS.
Oh, Rose?
Charlie Rose,
Okay.
Thank you. And a number of conversations, and really interesting. The two men have at each other sometimes, like last night. But in one such interview, Cook said that Apple has now 100 people just improving the camera on the iPhone, just working in the camera. And I think that's kind of disruptive too. At first, okay, it was a picture, no big deal, you know, not so good.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, they ate the lunch of all these digital camera makers because their pictures are far better for essentially no extra money.
Right.
Now you can take a picture. I can take a movie is part of the disruption too. I can take a movie, I have taken a movie on my cell phone, and the resolution is good enough to show on cable TV. How do you like that?
Yeah.
For my cell phone, didn't cost me anything.
Sure, they're making movies, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, artistic movies, right? And commercial movies, just with cell phones now occasionally. So, yeah. And I think that is part of the shift from, and even with computers, we see this too. You know, in the early days of computing, it was pretty much about textual communication. You know, email and chat rooms and the multiplayer games were. You know, you'd have to go into a chat room in the early days, you know, Web 1.0, and it would, instead of being a visual interface, you know, it would be like, you are now entering the kitchen, and then you could, you know, make an announcement to the rest of the group, you know, and now we're seeing a movement towards a much more visual mediated experience. And I think it's more economical, and that's part of what people want to do, is they want to say more with less.
It's empowerment. It's a democratization.
Yeah.
Every Joe can be empowered. So I mean, it's not only the photos and the movies; it's all the social media, the leverage, social media, and he can speak to the world. He can go wildfire on information anywhere in the world.
And it is empowering, and it does give people a new voice in a new way. You know, the media used to be this broadcast system. We still have broadcast, but
one way. One
way, and you really had to have power or money or both to get your voice heard, right? And now anybody has the potential of getting their voice heard, you know, when things go so-called viral or whatever. And that's great, but I think the other side of this, though, I'm just thinking my Uber ride downtown last night, right? My Uber driver was telling me, and I didn't tell her that this is what I study. People just like to talk about cell phone stuff, right? And I didn't bring this up, she did. She was telling me about how she witnessed an accident with a moped a couple weeks ago, and the woman just went flying and got completely banged up and had to go to the hospital. Ambulance came and all that. But the first thing she did was, before even checking out whether she was bleeding or not, was to take a photograph and to post it to Facebook to everybody to show what just happened to her.
Document it.
Document it. And then somebody else, she told me, had gotten stabbed in the calf. A woman got in a fight, got stabbed in the calf. Took a picture of that. First thing she did before going to the hospital, posted it to Instagram. Evidence. And I think people want to construct narratives in their lives, but I also think maybe some people are kind of automatically becoming oriented to feel like they have to share things or it's not real, you know?
Yeah, right. And they have to share it publicly. It's so interesting. But I want to add another piece of disruptive fuel to the fire.
Please.
A few years ago, something in the paper about how Apple had created a file. I'm really mixed on Apple. They had created a file that recorded your GPS location every millisecond or something, you know, like all the time. Wherever you went, to a tolerance of maybe a few feet, it was recording something on your cell phone.
Right.
Just kept on going.
Right.
And they said to Apple, what's this? You know, this isn't helping me. You're not giving me any information that I need. Why do you have a file that's keeping this record? And Apple stonewalled that. And then they asked him, are you actually taking this off my phone? Are you communicating it back to some central repository of GPS records? And Apple stonewalled that too. And we never knew why. But, you know, it shows you potentially, and they knew, the power of knowing GPS, where you are every foot of your life, every second or hour of your life, and where everybody is. I mean, and now there's this thing, I think it's called the chip or something, where it's very interesting. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's an app, okay? And if I want to make sure at the location of a given thing, like my bicycle, okay, I put the chip on my bicycle.
Right.
And my cell phone tells me when the bicycle is more than X feet away, it rings an alarm. Okay, but that's not the end of the creativity. It's a network of people. Everybody who has a chip is looking for anything that may have been lost by anybody who has a chip.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if the bicycle winds up stolen across town,
Right.
and there's somebody on the chip network spots that bicycle on his cell phone,
Yeah.
it tells you who stole the bicycle and where the bicycle is located. This is really scary. GPS can be really scary. I think it's another disruptive piece, yeah.
Absolutely. I like the way that you characterize it as disruptive, because you know, both good things and bad things can come out of disruptions. You know, some things should be disrupted, but I agree. It's the surveillance aspect of this can get a little creepy. You know, it can get a little Orwellian at times, I think.
Yeah, it's not only being in Walden Pond, it's being subject to being watched. Let's suppose that Apple file is available to Apple.
Right.
Okay, then somebody knows where you are all the time. You cannot hide.
Right. And your expectations, while your expectations for accessibility go up, your expectations for privacy go down, or they should go down anyhow.
And now when we come back from this break, we're going to describe the psychosocial effect of that.
Okay.
With low expectations for privacy, how does your life change?
Okay. Okay.
I love this conversation. I knew I would. That's Scott Campbell,
Right.
former professor at HBU, now here visiting HBU and UH from Michigan. This is Think Tech Talks. We're talking about the real message of cell phones.
Aloha, this is Reg Baker and I am the host of Business in Hawaii. We talk about positive stories of businesses in Hawaii, how they have been successful and how they have overcome some of the obstacles that a lot of us encounter when we try to have a business here. And believe it or not, there are a number of positive stories here, and we want to talk to all of you. So we broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock, and it rebroadcasts again on Olelo Channel 54. So I sure hope to see you next time. Please tune in on Thursdays at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host the show called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. We go beyond outrage to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I hope you will join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We broadcast live from thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and bye-bye.
3, 2, 1. We're back. We're live with Scott Campbell talking about cell phones, the real message here on Think Tech Tech Talks. So Scott, during the break, we're talking about embedding. Mm-hmm. What is embedding and why should we know about embedding?
Well, this is something that myself and some of my colleagues are becoming interested in, and I think it, to me, is like the most recent, important, interesting shift in the technology is that it's gone through this transition of being new and revolutionary to being old hat and second skin, second nature, right? And I think of that as embedding. We think of it, if you think of it on the social level, right? In our social collectives and in society, if you don't have access to a cell phone, right? If you think about that, what would you be like as a person if you didn't have access to it? You know, I have a hard time finding anybody who doesn't have access to it, right? It's a taken for granted assumption. And so in that sense, it's embedded. My colleague Rich Ling has written a book about this, and I want to give him some credit for this. But, you know, become embedded in our society in the same way that mechanical timekeeping has, right? You're not a fully functioning human being if you don't tell time. You know what I mean? It doesn't work. You're going to fall through the system. And I think that we can take that and apply that to the psychological level of the self, that the technology has become embedded in who we are, an extension of who we are, a basic expectation, and something that we don't think about as much anymore. It's moved from the foreground to the background of our consciousness. And I think this is important because it's a part of who we are. It's a symbolic representation of who we are sometimes. We decorate our cell phones. I don't, but my students do, you know. And whether you have an iPhone or whether you have Android says something about you, right? And so I'm interested in sort of this cognitive link that we have with the technology, right? It's a part of who we are now, right? And
identity. It's part of our identity.
It's part of our identity. And we're so connected to it that we feel it beckoning us because we're ready for that, even when it doesn't. You know, phantom vibrations. Have you ever had one of those?
Sure.
All right, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so the phone buzzes, right? And you're like, oh, oh, I got a call or I got a text or whatever, right? And oh,
Nothing.
no, I didn't.
Nothing.
You're just waiting for it, right?
Waiting for it.
And you're not consciously thinking about it. It just happens naturally.
Yeah.
So I think that that this gives rise to some interesting new problems that we're trying to deal with, some new challenges. I did some research with a graduate student trying to explain why it is that people are texting while driving when we now know it's really dangerous, right?
It is indeed.
Your chances of an accident go up like over 1,200% if you text and drive. You look down for a second and boom,
Yeah.
so much happens.
Yeah.
And it's not that people are ignorant anymore. Maybe in the early days they were ignorant of it. They're not, but it's still common. Like over a third people admit to doing it. If a third of the people are admitting to doing it, I suspect that a lot more people are actually doing it. And so why? And so we looked at this idea that maybe they're not thinking. Maybe it's just such second nature embedded as part of the self that if it beckons you, without even thinking, you reach for it. Or if you have an experience like getting stabbed in the calf, you don't even think about it. You grab it, you capture that moment, and you share it with other people, So the embedding in the technology is interesting, and we've got to figure out ways of taking the fish out of water so that people are more conscious about this, because it can get dangerous sometimes,
Well, it's a compulsion.
Sure.
I mean,
for
they're
some people, yeah.
compelled. Yeah, the psychological. It must be a psychological name for that, where you can't resist, even though you know it's wrong.
Well, some people call it addiction, actually.
Addiction.
Yeah. There's a study that came out today in Computers and Human Behavior, and another journalist contacted me and asked me to comment on it, and I hadn't read it, and I was, I'm going to the beach, so maybe you should ask so-and-so else. But
I'm going down to Think Tech. I got to have a talk show.
I got to go have a talk show, right? I got something else on the books. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, a lot of people are talking about it as addiction. I'm not saying it's not addiction, but I think that the framework I'm more comfortable with is habit. I call it habit. Habit means you do something frequently without really thinking about it. Habits can be great too. Like you don't want to have to relearn how to use a stapler every time you use a stapler. That would be awful if we didn't have these natural, if we didn't have these sort of less conscious processes to help us get through life. But with mobile communication, we need to be conscious of when it can be useful and when it can be actually dangerous or disruptive, as you might say.
Yeah. Well, this takes me to another level because, you're talking about the individual. You're talking about the effect on the individual and how he may be engaging in conduct that's destructive or self-destructive. But if you raise the whole conversation up to, say, a country or a world, everybody walking around with empowered cell phones, but cell phones are capable of surveillance cell phones that connect him everywhere instantaneously, cell phones that make him part of the web of social media. I mean, all the functionality now. It's not just the one guy, it's the world has this.
Right.
So my question to you is, how does this change the world? How does it change government, politics, democracy? How does it change collaboration in science and academia? How does it change the way we relate to people we don't even know?
Right.
We could have friends we've never even met. So we have a different kind of trust arrangement with friends we've never met.
Right.
All of a sudden, we're involved in a different world.
Yeah.
How does this change the world?
Well, I think if we're going to talk about this kind of thing, and especially at this point in time with maybe about 5 minutes left in the show,
Right.
it's important to recognize that the cell phone isn't in a vacuum, that it's part of a larger media ecology, right? It's part of what we use the cell phone mobile communication for, right, is oftentimes what we're doing on our laptops or our computers or our tablets or other types of systems. And so all of this together, I think you're asking me for kind of a broad statement now. And all of this together, I think, is reflective of our ability to connect with people based on our mutual interests. Whereas if you want to go back maybe a couple of generations ago, I think we were talking about really our connections were more based on our shared space, the neighborhoods that you lived in, right? That's where your connections happened. That's where your identity was formed. And now we have the ability to connect not just through cell phones, but through other technologies as well, to overcome the boundaries of space and time and connect based on mutual interests, which is empowering. Globally, that's right. And one thing about mobile communication that I haven't mentioned yet is that we've never seen a communication technology diffuse more quickly and more widespread around the world. Never. Smoke signals, television, the internet, computer, it doesn't matter. Newspaper, the cell phone surpasses all of these things and faster. If you look at the developing world compared to wealthy societies, right? The gap between the cell phone haves and have-nots is pretty narrow, actually, compared to other forms of internet access or TV or other media. It kind of leapfrogged over other media. And so we are talking about a global phenomenon.
It's irresistible too, and I've heard this said, recently. For example, the line between a poll, political poll, or any poll, and a formal vote, maybe through the electoral college, what have you, through a house of representatives, it changes the thing. I could take my poll, so to speak, and instead of posing it to a sample, I could pose it to the whole population. I could say, how do you feel about this issue or that?
Right.
Vote.
Right.
If you don't care to vote, you don't get counted. If you vote, you'll get counted. And so people would be motivated to do that. And I believe I could make technology that would avoid scams and frauds about double voting and triple voting,
Right.
one phone, one vote.
I don't think they would let you do that.
No, it's not going to, there's been
But
a
I think
lot
you're
of
right. It's
pushback
possible.
on, what do you call it, computer voting.
Yeah, right.
But
right.
it's coming, it's irresistible.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to change government. If I could make a poll that is arguably as accurate as a vote,
Yeah.
then why do I need a
vote.
governmental body? Why do I need layers of representatives and agents who are supposed to be voting with my interest in mind? Why don't you let me vote? I'll vote.
Right.
I think this is going to change. I think it is changing things.
Sure. Yeah. It seems pretty archaic to have to take time off of work on a Tuesday and go physically show up and fill out a little bubble, with a number 2 pencil or whatever the case is, right? Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if you're familiar with a book called The Circle by Dave Eggers. It came out a few years ago. Anyhow, this is exactly what he was writing about in this book, was getting to a moment where everything is completely transparent and everybody is part of the same system, and you don't need samples. You have access. Everything is universal. All knowledge is universal, right? And I think in terms of, we're talking about government, right? And we're talking about surveillance and privacy. And I was talking about how creepy it is, that every possible movement can be tracked now, but at the same time, we do have people, regular, ordinary citizens, that can monitor election fraud, right, with their mobile devices. And people can serve the role as journalists during natural disasters and things, or during terrorist attacks when journalists can't get in there.
With
right?
images and movies already.
Right, and blogs and
Yeah,
things like that. Yeah, we saw this with the London tube bombings in 2005 is kind of one of the first instances. But at any rate, so it cuts both ways, right? So the individual might lose some of the privacy and the freedom they have, but then at the same time, maybe the powers that be have a little bit too much privacy, and it's nice to impose some of the transparency on them, if we're talking about election fraud or something like that.
But I think you've hit on something, and that is that I know I'm giving up my walled-in pond and my privacy and my, ability to think alone, be alone. But I am so excited about the technology. I am so excited about being part of a global phenomenon where I can pick up my phone and I can have a Skype chat with somebody in Tibet right now,
Right.
instantly and accurately. That I don't care about the dark side of it. I am so enjoying the technology. But let me ask you one last question before
Okay.
we close, and
Sure.
that is, what do you see for the future? Where, to the extent we can see into the future, you can see it, what do you see coming down the pike on these very issues?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to qualify. I try to be more of somebody who explains what's going on rather than forecasting the future. But if you're going to put me on the spot, I would say that I was talking about this idea of embedding earlier, and I think we're going to see a continuation of embedding. I think we're going to see what it is that we're doing with this device becoming more and more embedded in the environment around us. We already see a lot of that now with virtual graffiti and the way that people are tagging places and that kind of thing. And so I think that this right now is kind of like a microcomputer, and I think that we're going to see the information and the flows that are coming and that are residing in this and coming through this more seamlessly in the environment around us. And I think this is going to be around for a while, but I think it's going to play a little bit more of a mediating role with you and your environment instead of containing all of the information and things in a central hub here.
That an Apple or an Android, Scott?
This is an iPhone. I recently made the switch to iPhone. I thought I would give it a shot. I'm really not an Apple guy. I have a PC in my office. So.
Are you happy with this phone?
Well, I'm happier with it now that I've taken email. My email app is off of there, and I don't have any social media on there because I'll tell you, it makes me a better parent. I've got an 8-year-old son, and I think that this is another thing I get a little concerned about, and the compulsion thing of it, is I know I get compulsive with email and things, and so I'm happy with this as long as I can draw my boundaries, and as long as I'm still conscious enough about it to flip this little switch to, I won't know when it rings during the right time. Then I'm okay with it.
That's really important. That's a great takeaway point.
I think so.
Draw your boundaries.
I think so.
Thank you, Scott Campbell.
Thank you.
Great to have you on the
Appreciate
show.
it. Thanks.
Aloha.
Aloha.